The match hissed against the striker strip and caught on the third try. A tiny orange flame wobbled in the draft that pushed through the broken window. Elowyn Stratton cupped her hand around that fragile light and touched it to the wick of a dollar store candle. She had been carrying the candle in her jacket pocket since morning. The flame steadied and threw a warm circle of golden light across a stone floor covered in decades of undisturbed dust. A bead of wax softened near the wick and ran down the side of the candle. It hardened against her thumb before it could drip. She was 21 years old with $43 in a zippered pouch inside her boot. She had no apartment, no car, and no family left anywhere in the world to call her own. Her grandmother, Orvie Mae Stratton, had raised her in a rented cottage outside Baileyton, Tennessee, a town so small it did not even have its own post office. For 15 years, Orvie Mae taught her granddaughter everything about wax and wick and flame. She showed Elowyn how to read the color of a burning candle to judge its temperature accurately. She taught her to feel the twist of cotton wicking in a dark room and know by touch alone whether it would burn clean or smoke. Those lessons in the art of chandlery were the steadiest thing in Elowyn's life, and now that Orvie Mae was gone, they were all she had left to hold on to. Orvie Mae passed 7 months ago after a quick illness. She went from standing at her work table to lying in a hospital bed in under 3 weeks. The landlord gave Elowyn 14 days to clear out of the cottage where she had grown up. She packed what she could carry into a canvas backpack. She tucked her grandmother's hammered copper cuff bracelet onto her right wrist. She walked out the door of the only home she had ever known. She did not look back because looking back would have broken something inside her. Since then, she had been sleeping in shelters and church basements. Once, she stayed in the back of a feed store where the owner let her remain if she swept the aisles before the morning customers arrived. She never once complained about any of it because complaining required energy she needed for walking. She kept moving through the foothills of Greene County with Nutmeg at her side. She was looking for a place that might hold still long enough for her to catch her breath and figure out what came next. Baileyton was a small, unincorporated community of maybe 400 people sitting in the rolling Appalachian foothills of East Tennessee. It was farm country through and through, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's truck by the sound of its engine. Tobacco barns listed to one side along the back roads, and cattle fences ran along gravel lanes that crossed each other at wide-open intersections. From those crossroads you could see the blue ridges stacked against the sky in every direction, shifting from purple to gray depending on the weather and the hour of the day. It was the kind of country that made you feel both very small and strangely held at the same time. It was at one of those crossroads that Elowyn found the Chandlery. She had been walking since sunrise along a gravel road that wound past a wildflower meadow. A split-rail fence ran alongside, gray with age and leaning southward. The air smelled like warm grass and distant rain and clover growing sweet in the ditches. Her dachshund, Nutmeg, trotted beside her on his short chocolate and tan legs. His velvet ears flopped with every step. His bright, dark eyes tracked every grasshopper and fence post. He weighed about 9 pounds, and most of that was pure personality. He believed, with complete conviction, that he was in charge of their journey together. She told Nutmeg they were almost there, though she had no idea where there was or what it might look like when they arrived. The Chandlery appeared where 2 gravel roads met at a wide intersection. The terrain around it was open and rocky with scattered trees and distant ridges on every side. The building itself was timber-framed, maybe 40 feet long with a stone foundation. A cedar shake roof sagged in the middle like an old horse's back. A crooked chimney rose from the rear wall. The windows were clouded with decades of grime. A hand-painted sign had once hung above the door but had fallen into the weeds. Morning glories had grown over it and sealed it to the ground. Elowyn stopped walking. She stared at the building without moving. Something about the shape of it told her exactly what it was. The wide chimney. The blackened stone around the foundation vents. She had spent her entire childhood walking past a building just like it. "That is a chandlery," she whispered. Nutmeg sniffed at the foundation stones and sneezed twice. She had grown up around candle making the way some children grow up around farming. It was in her body's own knowledge. Her grandmother had worked in a small chandlery in Greenville for 30 years before her knees gave out. Eowyn knew the smell of rendered tallow and the feel of warm beeswax between her fingers. She understood the careful art of dipping and molding and timing the way a musician understands rhythm. She tried the door. It was warped, but not locked. It scraped open across a stone-flagged floor, and the smell hit her like walking into a memory she did not know she carried. Old wax, cold tallow. Dust settled so thick it had turned to felt, and beneath everything, the faint sweetness of beeswax soaked into wooden beams over a full century of patient work. She called hello into the dark room, but nobody answered. Nutmeg walked in ahead of her with his nails clicking on stone. He sniffed along the base of the wall and then sat down in a square of gray light from the nearest window. He looked up at Eowyn with an expression that said, "This place will do just fine." The interior was a single long room. Along the right wall stood 3 large cast-iron vats. Each one measured about 4 feet across. They sat on brick platforms with fireboxes beneath. Dipping racks hung from the ceiling beams, still holding ancient tapers that had turned the color of old bone. Shelves lined the left wall with molds and wicking spools and jars of dried pigment. Everything wore a thick layer of dust and cobwebs that swayed in the draft. Eowyn walked the length of the room slowly. Her candle threw shadows that moved like water across the stone walls. She touched one of the vats and found it cold and rough with residue. She scraped her thumbnail across the rim and lifted it to her nose. Beeswax. Still there. Still sweet and unmistakable after all those decades of silence and dust. She slept in the chandlery that night. She spread her blanket on the stone floor near the middle vat where the draft was weakest. Nutmeg curled against her stomach like a warm loaf of bread. The dollar store candle burned low beside them, while the building settled around them with the small creaking sounds that old timber makes when it is no longer alone. She found the county records office the next morning. It was in the basement of the Greene County Courthouse. A woman named Trudy Pallister worked the front desk. She had silver hair pulled back with a tortoiseshell clip and reading glasses on a beaded chain. Trudy recognized the place right away. She said the old chandlery at the Hobbs Hollow crossroads had been sitting empty since before she started working there. The last owners were a family named Sevier, who made candles for churches all through those mountains. The property had reverted to the county for back taxes in 1987. Eowyn asked if the property could be purchased, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. Trudy looked at her over those reading glasses and told her she could buy it for $10. Nobody had wanted the place in 35 years, and the county would just be glad to get it off the books. "I have $10, Eowyn said. Trudy blinked twice. Trudy asked if she was serious, and Eowyn told her yes, ma'am, completely serious. Trudy studied her for a long moment. She took in the canvas backpack and the worn boots and the copper bracelet. She looked down at Nutmeg sitting politely at the foot of the counter with his ears perked. Trudy glanced down at Nutmeg, who was sitting with perfect posture beside the counter, his ears perked and his dark eyes polite. She asked if the dog was hers and whether he was house-trained. Eowyn told her he was better trained than most people she had met. Trudy almost smiled at that and reached beneath her desk for a folder of county forms. The process took 2 hours. Eowyn signed every page with a pen Trudy lent her. When the deed was finished, Trudy pushed it across the counter and looked at Eowyn over her reading glasses. "Congratulations," Trudy said. "You now own a building that smells like candle wax and broken dreams." "I like candle wax," Eowyn answered, "and the dreams I can fix." She moved in that same afternoon. She swept the floor with a broom she found in the corner. She cleared cobwebs from the windows until the light flooded through and turned the stone walls warm and gold. She wiped down the shelves with a damp rag she tore from an old shirt. She set up a sleeping area in the back corner using her shelter blanket and her backpack as a pillow. Nutmeg circled 3 times on the blanket before settling down with a sigh of pure contentment. He had decided this was home. That evening, a dented green pickup truck pulled up outside. A man stepped out. He was maybe 60 with thick white hair and a jaw carved from hickory. His name was Royce Emerton. He owned the cattle farm, half a mile down the road. He said he had seen lights in the Chandlery and thought somebody might be messing around in there. Elowyn told him she had bought the place that morning from the county. Royce looked around the dusty room with its cobwebbed vats and ancient dipping racks and took a slow breath through his nose. He asked what she was planning to do with it. "Make candles," she said. "It is a chandlery, and that is what it is for." He laughed at that, a warm sound like gravel shifting in a dry creek bed. He asked if she knew anything about candle making. "My grandmother taught me everything she knew. I have been working with wax since I was 6 years old." Royce studied her for a long moment. His eyes moved to the copper bracelet on her wrist and stayed there. He asked if her grandmother happened to be Orvie May. Elowyn felt her breath catch. "You knew her?" Everybody in Greene County knew Orvie May Stratton. She made the altar candles for every church from here to Tusculum. He paused, and his voice softened. He said Orvie May would be real glad she was here. Elowyn did not trust herself to answer that. She nodded once and turned back to her sweeping. The broom scraped against stone in a steady rhythm. Nutmeg watched from his blanket with his chin resting on his paws and his tan eyebrows twitching slightly as he tracked her movements across the dusty room. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep telling these quiet Appalachian tales. Elowyn spent the next 3 days scraping wax residue from the vats with a putty knife. She cleared the fireboxes of ash and old debris. She oiled the dipping racks and tested every mechanism. She sorted through the shelves and organized every mold and spool and jar she could find. The work was slow and dirty and satisfying in a way that nothing had been since her grandmother died. On the 4th day, she decided to clean behind the wax vats. The space between the vats and the back wall was narrow, maybe 2 feet. It was packed tight with old rags and broken candle stubs and dust that had turned to gray paste over the decades. Elowyn squeezed into the gap with a broom and a bucket. Nutmeg tried to follow her and got his long body wedged between the first and second vat. She had to back him out by his hindquarters while he whined about the indignity of it. She told him to stay put and guard the front of the shop. He sat down, facing the door with his ears at attention. He took his orders seriously, even the small ones. She swept behind the first vat and found nothing but grime. Behind the second vat, she noticed something that made her stop. One section of the back wall was made of different stone. It was about 3 feet wide. The mortar was lighter in color and smoother in texture than the rest. It was newer by maybe 50 or 60 years. Someone had sealed up this section of wall long after the chandlery was built. She tapped on it with her knuckle. It sounded hollow. The hair on her arms stood straight up. She found an old iron chisel on the shelves and worked it into the newer mortar. The mortar crumbled easier than she expected. Within 20 minutes, she had pulled 4 stones free and exposed a cavity in the wall. It was about 3 feet deep and 4 feet tall. It was a storage niche built into the original wall and then sealed up by someone who did not want its contents found. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, she found 4 bundles that changed everything about her future in Baileyton. The first bundle contained 12 hand-carved candle molds made for beeswax liturgical candles. These were the tall kind used on church altars during services. Each mold was carved from dense hardwood. Each bore a different biblical scene rendered in intricate relief. A shepherd with his crook standing among sheep, a dove descending through carved clouds, a burning bush with flame patterns so precise you could count each leaf. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Elowyn turned one mold in her hands and felt the confidence of cuts made more than 150 years ago. "These are museum pieces," she whispered to herself in the dark behind the vat. The second bundle held 6 pewter candelabra. They were heavy and tarnished, almost black. When she rubbed one with her jacket sleeve, she could see maker's marks stamped into the base. Southern silversmiths, pre-Civil War. The metalwork was elegant, with twisted stems and scalloped drip pans. The third item was a hand-bound leather book, about 8 by 10 inches. When Elowin opened it carefully, she stopped breathing for a moment. It was a beeswax recipe and color formula book. Every page was hand-illustrated. Detailed instructions for different wax blends filled each leaf. Beside every recipe was a botanical watercolor painting of the plants used for pigments. Pressed between many pages were actual pigment samples. Tiny squares of colored wax in indigo, madder red, goldenrod yellow, and deep forest green. The colors were still vivid after more than a century between those pages. Elowin whispered, "Oh, my Lord," and turned another page with trembling fingers. Every leaf of the book revealed something more extraordinary than the last. The fourth item was a walnut box dovetailed at the corners. Inside sat 18 hand-poured colored wax seals in carved slots. Their corresponding brass seal stamps lay beside them in matching grooves. Each stamp bore a different design. Family crests, merchant marks, a church cross with radiating lines, a pair of crossed candles topped by a single flame. The seals glowed in deep reds and midnight blues and forest greens, still glossy after all those years of darkness behind the sealed wall. The craftsmanship of the entire collection spoke of a family that had taken enormous pride in their trade. They had wanted to preserve the finest examples of their work for someone who would understand what they meant. Elowin understood. Elowin sat on the cold stone floor behind the vats with Nutmeg in her lap. The objects lay arranged around her in the narrow space. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against the warm fur of his back until they steadied enough for her to think clearly about what to do next. She carried everything to the front of the room. She laid each piece on the cleanest shelf with the careful reverence her grandmother had taught her to show old things. Then she walked to Royce's farm because she did not own a phone. She told him from his porch that he needed to come see what she had found behind the wax vats. Royce arrived at the chandlery in 15 minutes flat. He stood before the shelf and did not speak for a very long time. He picked up one of the carved molds and held it close to his face. He said quietly that those were Sevier molds. The family had made liturgical candles for churches across the Appalachian South from the 1840s to the Civil War. People had been looking for their mold sets for decades. Elowin pointed to the maker's marks on the candelabra bases, and Royce tilted one toward the window light to study the stamped impression. He recognized it as the mark of a Knoxville pewtersmith working before 1860, a mark he had seen in reference books on Southern metalwork. He told her quietly that the pieces were worth real money. She would need a proper appraiser, but the molds alone could bring $15,000 to $20,000. The whole collection together might bring $40,000 or more. Elowin leaned against the cold iron vat and pressed both hands over her face. Nutmeg stood on his hind legs and put his front paws on her knee. She reached down and scratched behind his velvet ears without looking. $40,000, she said through her fingers. Royce told her the seal stamps alone were rare, and that collectors pursued pre-war merchant marks with a passion that bordered on obsession. The recipe book, he said, was truly one of a kind, and might be the most valuable piece of all to the right institution or collector. She lowered her hands and looked at the shelf. She looked at 12 molds and 6 candelabra and a handmade book and 18 seals with their stamps. She looked at the work of hands that had been still for 150 years, and she made a decision that surprised no one who understood what candle-making meant to her. "I am not selling all of it," she said firmly. She kept 2 of the molds, the entire recipe book, and 3 of the wax seal stamps. The rest she consigned to a specialty auction house in Knoxville that handled Appalachian antiques and devotional crafts. An appraiser in white cotton gloves valued the collection at $36,000 to $49,000. The auction brought $42,600. That figure was more money than Elowin had seen in her entire life combined and multiplied. With that security behind her and $900 spent on renovation supplies, Elowin transformed the chandlery. She repaired the cedar shake roof herself using salvaged shakes from a demolished barn at $40. She repointed the foundation mortar with 3 bags of mix at $12 each. She cleaned the cast iron vats and seasoned them until they gleamed like dark mirrors. She built a sales counter from reclaimed barnwood set on 2 sawhorses. She sanded the surface smooth and oiled it with linseed until the grain glowed warm. The total renovation came to $900 even. She needed a reliable source of beeswax, and the best one in Greene County was Hattie Colvard. Hattie was 74 years old and ran 60 hives in the valley below Hobbs Hollow. She had been keeping bees since she was a teenager and could read the mood of a hive the way most people read a room. She was sharp as a tack, strong as braided wire, and skeptical of everyone under 40 on general principle. She stood in the chandlery with her arms crossed tight across her chest. She asked Elowin whether she actually knew how to work beeswax or if this was some hobby project that would fizzle by autumn. "I can dip a taper, pour a pillar, and hand-carve a mold," Elowin said. "I can mix natural pigments from plant materials and calculate burn rates by wick gauge and wax density." Hattie uncrossed her arms slowly. Hattie uncrossed her arms slowly when she heard that Elowin's grandmother was Orvie May. She said she had bought candles from Orvie May for 20 years and never once burned anything else in her house. "I reckon you know what you were doing then," Hattie said. She offered to sell wax at cost for the first 6 months. Elowin started making candles the following week. She used the antique recipe book as her guide, adapting old formulas with local materials. She made beeswax tapers dyed with walnut hull and pokeberry. She poured pillars scented with wild bergamot and mountain mint gathered from the meadows around the crossroads. She carved decorative molds inspired by the Sevier originals. She pressed wildflower patterns into warm wax with tools she made from bent spoons and whittled sticks. The first finished candle was a beeswax taper dipped 24 times to build proper thickness. She lit it at dusk on the windowsill. It burned with a steady golden flame and filled the chandlery with the smell of honey and summer meadows. Nutmeg sat beside it and watched the light with a focus that bordered on reverence. His chocolate-brown head tilted to one side as if the flame were telling him something important. Word reached every corner of Baileyton within 3 days. That is how news travels in a community of 400 people where everybody sees everybody at the gas station and the feed store and at church on Sunday morning. A woman named Fern Tollison came by the first week. She had played the organ at Baileyton Baptist for 22 years and had been ordering altar candles from a catalog company for the last 15 of them. Fern asked from the doorway whether Elowin could really make proper liturgical candles right there in Baileyton. Elowin told her she could make them beeswax and hand-dipped, just the way the Sevier family had made them 170 years ago in that very room. Fern clasped her hands together and said she needed 24 for Easter, and she needed them yesterday. If you know someone who loves stories about small towns and second chances, share this video with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. Within a month, Elowin had standing orders from 7 churches across Greene County. By the 3rd month, she was packaging candles in straw-lined boxes and shipping them to congregations in 4 different states. The demand grew faster than she had imagined possible. She hired a part-time helper named Tessie Tillman, a quiet local teenager with steady hands and quick eyes. Tessie had a willingness to learn that reminded Elowin of herself at that age, standing beside Orvie May at the work table and learning the difference between a good pour and a great one. Royce came by most evenings after he finished his farm chores. He leaned in the doorway with his hat pushed back and watched Elowin work the dipping racks. She pulled long, even tapers from warm wax with a rhythm that looked like music made visible. Dip and lift. Dip and lift. Each pass adding a thin, golden layer. He told her one evening that she looked just like Orvie May when she did that. "She taught me the count," Elowin said without breaking rhythm. "Dip for 3, hang for 5, turn for 2, over and over until the taper is right." Nutmeg had appointed himself quality control inspector of the entire operation. He sat on a folded towel near the drying racks and sniffed each batch of candles as they cooled to room temperature. If he sneezed, Elowin counted it as approval. If he turned his head away, she knew something was off with the scent blend, and she would check it again from scratch. The method was not scientific by any standard, but it had never once failed her, and Tessie learned quickly to watch the little dachshund's reactions before packing any finished batch for delivery. The recipe book became Elowin's most treasured possession. She studied the botanical watercolors every morning before lighting the fireboxes. She matched the illustrated plants to wild species growing in the meadows around Hobbs Hollow. She hiked the ridgelines to gather woad leaves and madder root and goldenrod petals. She dried them on screens in the sunshine. She recreated pigments that had not been mixed in 150 years. A deep indigo from woad required 3 days of fermentation and straining. A rich red from madder root took boiling and careful reduction. A soft gold from goldenrod needed steeping and filtering through cheesecloth. The old recipes were precise. The Sevier family had known their craft completely. She began making what she called heritage candles. Each one was hand-poured in a carved mold. Each was tinted with a single botanical pigment. Each was sealed with colored wax using one of the antique brass stamps she had kept. She packaged them in brown paper tied with cotton string. A handwritten tag explained the pigment and its history. They sold for $28 each, and she could not make them fast enough to keep up with the orders that came in by phone and mail and word of mouth. Customers drove from Knoxville and Johnson City just to visit the chandlery and buy them in person. Some ordered a full set of every available color to display on their mantels and windowsills. Others came back month after month to see what new pigment Elowin had discovered in the meadows and ridgelines around Hobbs Hollow. A reporter from the Greenville Sun wrote a front-page story about the young woman who bought a chandlery for $10 and found a fortune behind the walls. That week, Elowin received 340 emails and 85 phone calls. She also received one handwritten letter on blue stationery from a 91-year-old woman in Jonesboro. The woman remembered Sevier candles burning on the altar of her childhood church. She said beeswax still made her think of Sunday mornings and white gloves and her mother's quiet singing voice. Elowin wrote back to every single person who reached out to her. The chandlery at the Hobbs Hollow crossroads slowly transformed. The roof sat straight and tight. The windows gleamed in the morning sun. The chimney stood true against the sky. Wildflowers grew thick along the split-rail fence where Elowin had scattered seeds. She hung a new hand-painted sign above the door on iron hooks that Royce helped her mount into the timber frame. It read Stratton and Sevier Chandlery, because she believed in honoring the people who came before her and in carrying their traditions forward with respect and care. She kept the recipe book in a glass display case near the counter. She opened it to a different page each week for visitors to admire. She kept the 2 liturgical molds on a high shelf where afternoon light caught the carved surfaces. Shadows of shepherds and doves fell across the stone wall when the angle was right. She kept the 3 wax seal stamps in a velvet-lined drawer and used them every working day. Hattie Colvard brought a jar of fresh honey one afternoon and stood looking around the chandlery for a quiet moment. Orvie May would have cried happy tears at the sight of this place. Hattie said softly, "The happiest kind there is." Elowin did not say anything to that. She just touched the copper cuff on her wrist and looked at the candles cooling on their racks. Each one carried forward a tradition that stretched back through her grandmother and the Sevier family before her. All those quiet craftspeople had poured their patience into warm wax and watched it become something beautiful and lasting. On a warm evening in late September, Elowin stood in her doorway watching the sun go down over the blue ridges. The gravel roads stretched golden in both directions. The wildflower meadow glowed pink and orange. Nutmeg sat at her feet with his tan eyebrows catching the warm light and his long body draped across the doorstep. Royce pulled up in his truck and leaned out the window. "How is business?" She told him she had a 6-week backlog on liturgical candles and a waiting list for the Heritage line. She was thinking about hiring a second helper. "Not bad. For a girl who showed up with $43 and a wiener dog?" Elowin smiled at that. "I showed up with $43, a wiener dog, and 15 years of knowledge from the best teacher who ever lived." "Orvie May always said you would land on your feet," Royce told her. "She also said every flame starts with a single match." Elowin looked at the candle, burning steady and golden in her shop window. "She was right about that, too?" Nutmeg yawned wide and stretched his long body across the doorstep. The split-rail fence threw long shadows across the gravel. Down in the valley, a church bell rang for evening vespers. The sound drifted up through the warm air and settled around the chandlery like a spoken blessing. Elowin knew those altar candles were hers. She had made them with her own hands in the same room where the Sevier family poured theirs generations before. She had bought a ruin for $10. She had found a forgotten legacy behind the wax vats. She turned old knowledge into new light and gave a dead building back its original purpose. Every candle she made carried her grandmother's steady hands in the rhythm of the dip and the turn and the patient waiting. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Paw and Trail Stories and hit the bell so you never miss a new tale. We will see you on the next quiet road. The match had caught on the 3rd try, but everything after that burned steady and true.